Welcome back, everyone, to Decoding Causality, Season 1. We're diving into Chapter 9 of the Book of Why by Judia Pearl and Dana McKenzie. This one is called Mediation, The Search for a Mechanism. And as always, this summary was prepared by Amir Rafe.
So this chapter kind of shifts gears a little bit. We've been talking a lot about identifying causes and effects. But this chapter goes deeper, asking, okay, we know what causes something, but how does it cause it? What's the mechanism? What are the steps in between?
It's like, yeah, we see the dominoes fall, but what makes each one knock over the next?
Exactly. It's not enough to just say, oh, well, this thing makes that thing happen. We want to unpack that process. Like, what are the gears turning? What are the levers being pulled?
And the book uses the example of scurvy to really drive that point home, right? Like, for a long time, people knew that citrus fruits prevented scurvy, but they didn't really know why. And that lack of understanding had some pretty serious consequences down the line.
Oh, absolutely. It's like, imagine you have this magic potion that cures headaches. You don't know what's in it, but it works. So you keep using it. But then one day the potion stops working. And it's like, well, now what? If you had understood the mechanism, the ingredients, you might have been able to figure out why it stopped working and maybe even fix it.
So this idea of looking for the how, the mechanism, is what scientists call mediation.
Right. And it's all about figuring out the chain of events. So like, let's say, for example, a new policy leads to lower crime rates. Mediation analysis would ask, okay, but how did that happen? Did the policy directly reduce crime, or did it maybe lead to more jobs? And the increase in jobs led to lower crime.
So in that case, the number of jobs would be the mediator. It sits in between the policy and the crime rate.
Exactly. And understanding these mediators can really change how we think about cause and effect. It lets us unpack these complex relationships and see the different pathways involved.
And what I found fascinating is that apparently just defining these, what do they call them, direct effects and indirect effects,
right,
has been kind of a headache for scientists for a long time. And part of the reason, the book says, is that there was this reluctance to really use causal language in statistics.
Yeah, it's almost like they were afraid of saying, this causes that. They were more comfortable with just describing correlations, like these things tend to happen together. But to really understand mediation, you have to think causally. You have to say, if this hadn't happened, would that other thing still have occurred?
So it's like we're moving from just observing patterns to actually trying to understand the underlying machinery.
Exactly. And that's why mediation analysis is considered a higher level kind of causal reasoning. It requires us to imagine these what-if scenarios, these counterfactuals, to really tease apart these direct and indirect pathways.
It's kind of funny, though, that there was resistance to the idea of indirect effects. I mean, it seems so obvious that things can have effects through other things. Like if I water my plants, they grow. But it's not like the water's like magically making them taller. It's like working through a bunch of biological processes.
I know, right? But, science is full of examples where what seems obvious now was once met with skepticism. Like imagine trying to explain germs to someone who's never heard of them. It's like, wait, these invisible things are making me sick? No way.
So it takes a shift in perspective, kind of like accepting that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around.
Exactly. And just like those scientific revolutions, understanding indirect effects gives us a much more powerful way to look at the world.
And the chapter uses some pretty compelling examples to show why this matters. Like they talk about the algebra for all education policy and the use of tourniquets in like war zones or emergencies.
Yeah, those are great examples because in both cases, it's not enough to just look at the overall outcome. You have to understand the mechanisms involved to really know if something's working the way you think it is.
So what I'm getting from all this is that thanks to this causal revolution, we now have the tools to actually measure these direct and indirect effects in a rigorous way.
Right. It's not just guesswork anymore. We can actually quantify how much of an effect is happening through each pathway. And that's a huge step forward in understanding how the world works.
Okay, so let's get back to that scurvy story. You mentioned that just knowing citrus fruits prevented it wasn't enough.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting, or maybe even a bit tragic. So back in the 1700s, James Lind did this groundbreaking experiment. He basically gave different groups of sailors different treatments for scurvy, and the group that got citrus fruits was the only one that recovered.
So that pretty much proved that citrus was the cure, right?
Yep. And based on that, the British Navy started giving their sailors citrus as part of their rations, and scurvy pretty much disappeared from their ships. Huge win for science, right?
For sure. But then what happened? Why did scurvy come back?
Well, fast forward about 100 years, you have these British polar expeditions in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And despite knowing about citrus, they started getting scurvy again. And what's crazy is that some of the leading medical experts at the time basically dismissed the importance of lime juice, which is a type of citrus.
So they knew it worked, but they didn't really believe it.
Yeah, it's wild. And it seems like part of the reason was that they had the wrong idea about how citrus worked. They thought it was the acidity of the fruit that was the key. So their thinking was like citrus fruits, acid, no scurvy.
I see. So they were focused on the wrong mediator.
Exactly. And because of that, they started making some really bad decisions. They switched from using lemons, which were more expensive, to limes, which were cheaper, but had much less vitamin C. And they even started processing the lime juice in a way that probably destroyed a lot of the remaining vitamin C.
Oh, no. So they were basically undoing the very thing that was protecting them.
It's like they thought they were being clever, but they were actually shooting themselves in the foot. And then when the sailors on these expeditions started getting scurvy again, it completely baffled the medical community.
Because in their minds, they were giving them the cure.
Right. And since they were stuck on this acidity idea, they started blaming other things like canned meat or some kind of poisoning. They completely missed the real culprit, lack of vitamin C.
It wasn't until later that they figured out the true mediator, huh?
Yeah. It wasn't until the early 1900s that scientists started understanding vitamins. And then in 1930, Albert Szent-Györgyi actually isolated vitamin C and showed that it was the key ingredient in citrus that prevented scurvy.
So the real causal pathway is citrus fruits, vitamin C, no scurvy.
Right. And the takeaway here isn't just about scurvy. It's about the importance of understanding the right mediator. Because if you're focused on the wrong one, you can make decisions that actually harm you, even when you think you're doing the right thing.
It's a powerful lesson.
Mm.
You know, it makes you think about all the things we might be doing wrong today because we don't fully understand how they work.
Absolutely. And that's why mediation analysis is so important. It helps us to really unpack these cause and effect relationships and identify the true drivers of change.
So after that dramatic story of, life and death on the high seas, the book shifts to a different kind of exploration.
Mm-hmm.
This debate about nature versus nurture and intelligence.
Ah, yes. The classic question. Is it our genes or our environment that shapes who we are? And this is where we meet Barbara Burks, a graduate student at Stanford back in the 1920s. She was really one of the first researchers to explicitly use a diagram to represent a mediator.
Really? Back then?
Yeah. And her work is fascinating because it tackles this really complex issue of how much of our intelligence is inherited versus how much is influenced by our upbringing.
A pretty hot topic even today, I guess.
Oh, for sure. And back in the 1920s, the eugenics movement was gaining a lot of traction, which really emphasized the idea of inherited intelligence. And Burks's advisor, Lewis Terman, was actually a big proponent of eugenics.
Wow, so she was kind of working in the lion's den, in a way.
You could say that. But despite that, she came up with this really insightful model. He said, okay, we know that a parent's intelligence can directly influence their child's intelligence through genetics. That's the nature part. But she also proposed that there's an indirect path. A parent's intelligence can also affect their child's intelligence through their social status.
So like smarter parents might have better jobs, more money, which creates a better environment for their kids to learn and develop.
Exactly. And in this model, social status is the mediator. It sits between parental intelligence and child intelligence.
So to test this, she studied foster families.
Right. Because by looking at children who were raised by foster parents, she could try to isolate the effects of the environment from the effects of genetics.
Clever. And what did she find?
Well, her results were actually pretty groundbreaking for the time. She found that only about a third of the variation in IQ could be explained by inheritance.
Oh, wow. So that means environment plays a much bigger role than many people back then thought.
Exactly. And her findings have actually held up pretty well over time. But what's really interesting for our discussion of mediation is that Burks was very critical of the standard statistical practice of controlling for social status when looking at the relationship between parental and child intelligence.
Why is that?
Well, she argued that by controlling for social status, you're basically ignoring the fact that social status itself is influenced by parental intelligence. It's like you're cutting out a crucial part of the causal story.
So it's like trying to understand how a car works by removing the engine and then wondering why it won't go anywhere.
Exactly. And she even identified specific conditions where controlling for a variable could actually introduce bias into your analysis what we now call collider bias.
Collider bias.
Yeah, it's a bit of a statistical quirk, but it can really mess things up. It happens when you control for a variable that's actually a common effect of two other variables you're interested in, and that can create a spurious correlation between those two variables, even if they're not really connected.
So in Burks's model, social status could be a collider because it's influenced by both parental intelligence and potentially other factors that are completely unrelated to intelligence.
Right, and by controlling for social status, you might create this artificial link between parental intelligence and those other factors. It's like you're accidentally connecting things that shouldn't be connected.
I'm starting to see why mediation analysis can be so tricky.
Oh yeah, it definitely requires careful thinking. And sadly, despite Burks's insights, she faced a lot of challenges in her career and died quite young. But her work was really ahead of its time and actually helped to inspire the revival of what's called path analysis in sociology decades later.
It's amazing how these ideas can sometimes lie dormant for years and then suddenly become really important.
Absolutely. And the story of the Berkeley admissions paradox is another great example of that.
Oh yeah, the one where women had a lower overall admission rate to Berkeley, but when they looked at individual departments, women were often admitted at a higher rate than men.
Yeah.
Like, how is that even possible?
It's a classic example of Simpson's paradox, where a trend appears in one direction in the aggregate data, but reverses when you look at subgroups. And what makes it so relevant to mediation is that it shows how misleading it can be to just focus on overall effects without considering the mechanisms at play.
Right, because if each department was favoring women, you wouldn't expect to see a lower overall admission rate for women. It just seems counterintuitive.
Exactly. And that's what made people suspicious that something else was going on. So two statisticians, Peter Bickel and Eugene Hamel, decided to investigate. And they came up with this causal story.
Which was?
Well, they said that women were more likely to apply to departments that were more competitive overall, like humanities and social sciences. These departments had more applicants and fewer slots available.
So even if those departments weren't discriminating against women, they would still have lower admission rates simply because more people were applying.
Right. And men, on the other hand, were more likely to apply to less competitive departments like engineering, which had more funding and more spaces available.
So the mediator here is the choice of department. And that choice was influenced by other factors like maybe societal pressures or gender stereotypes that were outside of Berkeley's control.
Exactly. And based on this analysis, Bickel and Hamel concluded that Berkeley wasn't actually discriminating against women applicants as a whole.
But hold on, the book says there was a distinction between bias and discrimination that Bickel made.
Oh, right. So Bickel was very careful to say that just because there wasn't evidence of discrimination by the university, that didn't mean there wasn't any bias in the system.
So what's the difference?
Well, he saw bias as just a statistical pattern, like a correlation. So the fact that women had a lower overall admission rate could be seen as a form of bias. But discrimination, in his view, implied a causal process where decisions were being made based on gender when gender shouldn't be a factor.
So it's like bias is just observing a difference, but discrimination is actively treating people differently because of their gender.
Exactly. And Bickel felt that by looking at the admission rates within each department, the key decision-making unit, they were essentially controlling for this potential bias in departmental choices and could isolate the direct effect of gender on admission.
But not everyone was convinced by this explanation, right?
Right. Another statistician, William Kruskal, raised some really important objections. He said, okay, even if we accept your causal story, how can you be sure there aren't other factors that are confounding the picture?
Like, what if there's some other variable that's influencing both departmental choices and admission decisions?
Exactly. And Kruskal even came up with a hypothetical example of a university with two departments, both of which were actually discriminating against women. But because of how the applicant pool was distributed, the overall admission rates could still end up looking like Berkeley's.
So the same overall data could be hiding very different underlying realities.
Right. And Kruskal's point was that without a clear way to identify and account for these potential confounders, you couldn't really rule out the possibility of discrimination.
And this is where those causal diagrams come in handy, right?
Yeah.
Because they can help us visualize these different pathways and see where the potential for confounding might be.
Exactly. And what Kruskal was really highlighting was this lack of a solid framework for deciding which variables to control for when trying to disentangle direct and indirect effects.
So it's not just about looking at the data, it's about understanding the causal structure of this system.
Right. And this debate about what to control for and how to interpret the results really highlights the challenges of mediation analysis. It's not a simple plug and chug kind of thing. It requires careful thought and a deep understanding of the causal relationships.
And this uncertainty about what to control for also created a lot of skepticism about mediation analysis, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Because it seemed like your conclusions could change depending on which variables you chose to focus on. And that made people wonder if it was even a reliable way to understand cause and effect.
So what was the missing piece? What did they need to really nail down these direct and indirect effects?
Well, the book argues that the key concept was the idea of holding constant. And this is where it gets a bit tricky. Because in statistics, we often talk about controlling for a variable, which usually means statistically adjusting for its influence. But to really understand an indirect effect, you need to conceptually hold the mediator constant and then see what happens when you change the cause.
So it's like, instead of just observing what happens naturally, we're imagining what would happen if we could somehow intervene and manipulate the system.
Exactly. And the problem with just statistically controlling for the mediator is that it can actually create misleading results, what the book calls the mediation fallacy.
The mediation fallacy.
Yeah, it's basically when you mistake the effect of controlling for a variable with the effect of actually intervening on that variable. And this can be really problematic, especially when there are other confounding factors involved.
So it's like you're looking at what happens within different groups, but you're not really seeing what would happen if you could actually change the mediator itself.
Right. And this fallacy actually tripped up a lot of really smart statisticians for a long time, including even R.A. Fisher, who is considered one of the founders of modern statistics.
Wow. So even the big names got caught in this trap.
Yeah. It took a while for people to really understand the subtle but important difference between controlling for a variable and intervening on it. And this is where those causal diagrams really shine, because they can help us to see those different pathways and avoid these pitfalls.
So are you saying that this problem of figuring out mediation was basically unsolvable for a long time?
Well, yeah, for a while it seemed that way. But the development of due calculus and the formal language of counterfactuals really revolutionized how we think about causation.
So these tools gave us a way to actually express those what-if scenarios in a rigorous way.
Exactly. And that opened up a whole new world of possibilities for understanding mediation.
What about the Berkeley case? Did they ever come to a definitive conclusion?
Well, not really. Bickel and Hamill maintain that there is no evidence of discrimination and there was never any legal action taken against Berkeley.
But the book does mention that there was some evidence suggesting that some departments might have been kind of favoring women in their admissions decisions to try to correct for historical imbalances.
Right. And that adds another layer of complexity to the whole story. But the main takeaway is that even without a clear resolution, the Berkeley case really highlights the challenges of trying to disentangle these causal pathways and the importance of having a solid theoretical framework to guide our analysis.
Okay, so after all that historical back and forth, how do we actually define and measure direct and indirect effects in a way that's, not going to lead us astray?
Right. So let's start with the idea of a control direct effect, or CDE.
Controlled.
Yeah. So imagine in the Berkeley case, we could somehow force all applicants to apply to the same department, regardless of their actual preferences, and then we randomly assign them a gender, like flipped a coin for each applicant.
So we're creating this artificial scenario where everyone's applying to the same department, but their reported gender is different.
Exactly. And then we look at the difference in admission rates between the group that was randomly assigned female and the group that was randomly assigned male. That difference would be the controlled direct effect of gender on admission for that specific department.
So it's like we're holding the department constant and just changing the gender to see what happens.
Right.
Yeah.
But as the book points out, this kind of controlled scenario can be a bit unrealistic because it doesn't reflect what actually happens in the real world.
Yeah, people don't just randomly apply to departments. They have preferences. They have reasons for choosing one over another.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of a natural direct effect, or NDE, comes in.
Natural.
Yeah. So here we're imagining a scenario where people still apply to the departments they would naturally choose, but we randomly assign them a gender. So it's like they're making their own choices, but the reported gender is different from their actual gender.
So it's more realistic because it takes into account people's actual preferences.
Right. And then we compare the outcomes for those who are randomly assigned female versus those who are randomly assigned male. That difference would be the natural direct effect of gender on admission.
But how do you actually measure that if you can't really randomly assign genders in the real world?
Well, that's where the power of causal modeling comes in. We can use statistical techniques and causal diagrams to estimate these natural direct effects from observational data.
Okay, so that's direct effects. What about indirect effects?
Right. So for indirect effects, there isn't really a controlled version in the same way as direct effects, because you can't really intervene to block the direct path while leaving the indirect path open.
I guess that makes sense.
Oh,
But there is still a concept of a natural indirect effect, right?
yes, exactly. And to explain this, they use a fun example about the author's dog, Daisy, and some foster kittens.
Oh, this sounds interesting.
So Daisy, the dog, wasn't perfectly house-trained, but when these kittens came to stay, she suddenly stopped having accidents. And then when the kittens left, the accidents started again.
So the author's wife thought it was a direct effect of the kittens on Daisy's behavior. Like, maybe the kittens somehow made her more aware of her house training.
Right. But the author suspected that it was an indirect effect. He thought that maybe the kittens led to Daisy being crated more often and getting more supervision, and that was what actually stopped the accident.
So the increased crating and supervision would be the mediator in this case.
Exactly. And to test his theory, the author actually did a little experiment. He started crating Daisy more and giving her more supervision even when the kittens weren't there.
Did it work?
The results were a bit inconclusive, but the point of the example is that it shows how thinking about potential mediators can help us to come up with alternative explanations for cause and effect relationships.
Yeah, it's like there might be this whole chain of events happening behind the scenes that we don't even realize.
Right. And to really understand the indirect effect, we need to imagine what would have happened if the cause had been present, but the mediator had been held constant at its baseline level. So in Daisy's case, it's like asking, what if the kittens had come, but Daisy hadn't been crated more often?
Ah, I see. So we're trying to isolate the effect that goes through the mediator, separate from any direct effect.
Exactly. And this kind of thinking really pushed statisticians to develop more rigorous ways to define and measure these indirect effects. Because it's not just about observing what happens naturally, it's about imagining what would have happened under different circumstances.
Just getting into those counterfactuals again.
Right. And defining these indirect effects precisely was actually a major challenge for a long time because it involved these double-nested what-if scenarios. But eventually, this led to the development of the mediation formula.
The mediation formula. Sounds important.
It is. It basically gives us a way to estimate these natural direct and indirect effects from data under certain assumptions. And it doesn't require us to assume any specific linear relationships between the variables.
So it's a more general way to understand mediation, even in complex, nonlinear systems.
Exactly. And it was a huge breakthrough because it finally gave researchers a practical tool to quantify the indirect pathways.
So before this, they were kind of just guessing.
Well, not exactly guessing, but they didn't have a clear, consistent way to measure these effects. And the mediation formula really changed that. It allowed them to say, okay, this much of the effect is happening through this mediator and this much is happening directly.
And the book makes a point that having a formula isn't just about like crunching numbers. It's also about having a shared language to talk about these concepts.
Absolutely. It's like once you have a formula, it becomes easier to communicate these ideas and to build on each other's work.
So the mediation formula was kind of like a catalyst for a whole new wave of research on mediation.
Right. And it's still a very active area of research today.
So to wrap up this chapter, they talk about some case studies where mediation analysis has been used to really understand important real-world issues.
Yes. And one of the most compelling examples is the Algebra for All policy in Chicago public schools.
Oh, right. The one where they made all ninth graders take algebra, even if they weren't necessarily ready for it.
Exactly. And the goal was to improve math performance and close achievement gaps.
Seems like a good idea in theory.
It does. But when researchers started looking at the data, the results were a bit mixed. At first, it seemed like the policy was working, test scores were going up, but then they realized that there was a potential confounding factor.
Which was?
Well, around the same time that they implemented Algebra for All, they also made some other changes to the school system, like reforms in earlier grades. And those reforms were also leading to improvements in student performance.
So it was hard to tell how much of the improvement in test scores was due to Algebra for All and how much was due to these other factors.
Right. So a researcher named Guanglei Hong decided to use mediation analysis to try to tease apart these effects.
And what did he find?
Well, he found that the direct effect of Algebra for All on test scores was actually pretty small.
So making everyone take algebra wasn't really the magic bullet they thought it would be.
Yeah, it seems that way. But what's really interesting is that he also looked at a mediator, the classroom environment.
What do you mean by classroom environment?
So he looked at the median skill level of the students in each classroom, and he found that the Algebra for All policy actually changed this environment in a way that might have been harmful for some students.
How so?
Well, by putting all ninth graders in algebra, it meant that some lower achieving students were now in classes with much higher achieving students. And that might have created a more competitive and less supportive learning environment for them.
I see. So even though the curriculum itself might have been okay, the way it was implemented actually created this negative side effect.
Exactly. And through mediation analysis, Hong was able to show that this negative indirect effect through the classroom environment almost completely canceled out the small, positive direct effect of the policy.
So the policy was basically working against itself.
Yeah, in a way. And this analysis was really important because it helped to explain why Algebra for All wasn't having the intended impact.
And did they do anything to address this problem?
They did. Based on these findings, they actually implemented a new program called Double Dose Algebra.
Double dose.
Yeah. So instead of just putting everyone in algebra, they gave lower achieving students 2 periods of algebra instruction per day.
So they were basically trying to compensate for the negative effects of the classroom environment by giving those students more support.
Exactly. And this program actually turned out to be quite successful.
Wow. So mediation analysis really played a crucial role in understanding the problem and coming up with a better solution.
Absolutely. And it's a great example of how this kind of analysis can be used to inform real-world decision-making.
So the big takeaway from this chapter is that understanding the mechanisms, the how, behind cause and effect relationships is just as important as identifying the causes and effects themselves.
Right, because it's only by understanding those mechanisms that we can really know how to intervene effectively and make the world a better place.
And as you go about your day, keep in mind that even seemingly simple cause and effect relationships might actually involve a whole chain of events that you don't even realize.
Exactly. So the next time you see something happen, don't just ask what caused it, but also ask how it was caused. You might be surprised by what you discover.
And that's it for this week's deep dive into the world of causal inference. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the Book of Why.
See you then.